Hello students, Dell here. I'm going to introduce the next material that we are going to use in this course, and that's clay. In order to do the exercises that you will be asked to do for remote attendance this week, you will need to have a few tools and materials on hand. Those of you who are fully remote should have already gotten a list and obtained those items, but those of you who are in person, you will pick some things up during your class meeting this week. If you know you want to start the exercises early and you say have class on Wednesday or Thursday, you are more than welcome to come in during one of my other classes or during open studio hours, which you can find listed under course information in the left menu of BB Learn. So the materials and supplies that you need for this, first off, we have some clay. This happens to be an air dry clay. We have a kit of tools that looks something like this, and we'll talk about the specific tools that are in here momentarily. You also need to source a few things for yourself. These are the things that you'll get from me, but some things that you should find on your own include a spray bottle like this one. This is not absolutely necessary, but it is so helpful as we move forward in working with clay. You can repurpose an old cleaner bottle, just rinse it out a few times, or buy a cheap one like this from the dollar store or someplace. All will work great. In addition, you need something that is cylindrical and relatively rigid in order to roll out clay slabs. In the classroom, we're going to be using a rolling pin like this one, but I don't want you to use your at-home rolling pin for clay unless you really like clay chunks in your bread. That's not going to work out very well for you. But there are some excellent and free substitutes. So if you have a glass bottle sitting in your recycling bin, that'll work wonderfully. A glass jar, same thing, will work just fine. You can potentially make plastic cylinder packaging work for you. It tends to be a little less rigid, but it may be okay. Metal one, same thing, a coffee can or something like that will probably work pretty well. And then finally, it's helpful to have a plastic container that's got a lid on it. So you can repurpose something like a yogurt container or a sour cream container or something like that. I just have this little Gladware container, again, very cheap at Target or the dollar store or something, but just something that has a lid on it. Okay, we are going to start out today by talking a little bit more about this material we'll be using for your next project, and that is clay. Clay is something that most of you have probably played with on some level in the past, but maybe you haven't thought much about what it is. At its most basic level, this stuff it's dirt. It's fine-grained soil that has clay molecules in it. And what's so special about this material is that when it gets wet, there's some water that surrounds those clay molecules, and it makes it very plastic. You can shape it easily into different sorts of forms. But when it becomes dry again, it's rigid and then it holds its shape at that point. This makes it a really wonderful material for making all kinds of different things, and that's probably why clay has been used really throughout history in pretty much every culture. It's often one of the first types of art that's made, and it's still a very versatile and expansive medium in the contemporary age. So let's talk about a few pros and cons of this material. There are really good things to this material and some things that aren't so great. One of the things that's really excellent about the material is that it is modelable. So when we talk about modeling in an art class, what we mean is shaping a soft material into forms. So you can shape the soft clay material into pretty much anything that your imagination and skill can cover. In addition to that, it's very versatile, so you can use it for all sorts of different things. There are a ton of different ways to work with it, a ton of different ways to finish it. It can be glazed, it can be painted, it can be used for vessels and things like cups and plates and everyday wear, or it can be built into huge sculptures. So again, an extremely versatile material. It is also pretty easy to get started with. There's sort of a natural affinity for working with clay that most of us have that help us make simple forms without too much difficulty. But then to flip to the con side of things, to really get good at clay or to make things that are pretty sophisticated, it can start to become increasingly, even exponentially more difficult. So I imagine some of you will have some frustration at times over the course of working with this project, and that's okay. It's something to be expected. In addition to being kind of difficult and having a bit of a learning curve, clay is something that is breakable when it gets to a certain point. It is, when you're actually working with it, it requires being wet in order to stay flexible. So you have to have that aforementioned water bottle or something like it to keep the clay moist so that it doesn't dry out and then you're kind of out of luck on it. If you're really going to do serious work in clay, you also need some heavy-duty equipment. That's kind of a con as well. So for those of you who have taken a ceramics class, maybe you're probably aware that they have big kilns to fire the clay, to bake it and make it stronger. We don't have any of that stuff in the 3D design classroom. So we're using a type of clay that is meant to be air dried, but as a result, we sacrifice some strength there. So, as with any material, there are pros and cons, but on the whole, clay is one of the most powerful sculpting materials that there is, and so it's important that you get some experience working with it. You can see that I have set up a working area for myself today. Clay is messy. That should be another thing that's definitely under the cons list. It has a tendency to get everywhere, so find a place in your home where you can contain it if at all possible. So I'm on a table here, and you'll notice I've also made myself a little mat to work on top of. You probably all have a bunch of cardboard sitting around from your second project. So taking a little piece of cardboard and working on top of that can help contain the mess. You may notice that this is shiny. I just covered this over with some packing tape. Scotch tape would work too, even masking tape would work, to create a surface that is a little water resistant, but I don't care if I get it dirty. So set yourself up a little workspace that you can comfortably shape the clay. Then you're going to want to have your tools handy to you. Let's talk a little bit about what's in this toolkit that you've got. So if I open this up, you see there's 8 tools in here. A sponge, which is very helpful for re-wetting your clay. As I mentioned, you have to keep clay wet. My clay block is sitting out here in the air right now, but generally speaking, you want to keep the clay wrapped in plastic at all times. It's just out here for demo purposes. So when you're working, cut off what you need, put this back in the plastic bag. So sponge for re-wetting. This can also be great for helping you smooth out the surface of your clay. We have 2 ribs. What these 2 tools are called are ribs. This metal one is really good for smoothing and shaping. It also is really bad about like going under fingernails. It can slice skin, so be a little careful with this guy. We also have a wooden rib. If you are in a ceramics class and you're working on a wheel, they use this to shape the clay as it spins against it on the wheel. But in our case, it's just really good for going along the surface of the clay and smoothing things out one way or the other. It's got lots of different surfaces for that. We have another shaping and sculpting tool here that's got a flat side. That's, again, good for smoothing and shaping. And then this pointed edge is great for cutting clay. It's great for incising or carving detail into things. In addition to those tools, we have a needle tool. The needle tool can be used to cut clay. It's also good for inscribing in the surface of clay, and it's going to be a very important tool for what's known as scoring and slipping, one of the most important techniques you will learn in this video. In addition to the needle tools, the shaper, and the ribs, we have 2 tools like this. These are trim tools or ribbon tools. They are also used when you're in a ceramics class where you're throwing on the wheel after you have clay that has dried a little bit and gotten to what's known as the leather hard stage. You put it back on the wheel and you can trim off extra by having the clay spin against the sharp edge of these tools. However, we won't use it for that in this class. We're just going to use it for shaping. It can be used for a very similar purpose for when you have your clay that's a little bit drier and you need to carve away part of the surface. These tools will also be used in a later project, so it's good to get used to how they operate. And then finally, we have this tool here, which comes wrapped up. And I hate this, trying to unwrap this thing. It's like the worst thing ever. I always get it really tangled up. Let's see if I can do this without too much difficulty today. So if you unwrap this thing, it comes out into 2 handles and a wire between them. This is just a wire cutter tool. You use this by putting your fingers on either end. You can even twist it around your fingers, and this is sort of murdery, I realize, but we're not going to murder anybody other than a block of clay. Then we draw this through our clay. Okay, so a wire cutting tool for cutting off chunks of clay. And then of course you've got your case. Try to keep these tools clean. These are going to be yours to use for the duration of the semester, but at the end of the semester you're going to have to turn them back in the condition that you got them. So try not to let a bunch of clay build up on them. In addition, you remember the things I showed you at the beginning, the spray bottle, the cylindrical form, the little cup. These can be things that are helpful to you as well. One thing I want to mention before we jump into this is, as I said, clay is messy. It'll get on your hands. It'll get on the tools. But you want to avoid going to your sink and rinsing off your hands or your tools directly in the sink. Because if you think about this, this is these dirt particles. Right now they're wet. They're suspended in water. It's pretty solid. But if you put this down the sink, this can potentially dry in the pipes of your sink and block up the pipes really, really bad. And that is going to upset whoever you live with or whoever owns your building. So do make sure that you take a wet paper towel and wipe your hands or your tools off as much as you can before you put them into a sink. In our classroom, we actually have what we refer to as the clay sink, which are buckets that are in our sink. So you'll wash your hands and your tools over those buckets, and the clay will go into the buckets and settle down to the bottom, and then we'll pour off the clear water at the top. You are never, ever, ever going to wash your tools or hands directly over the drain. So very important. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Okay, so with the preliminary stuff out of the way, let's actually make some stuff with this clay. For your remote learning this week, you're going to have to make 3 different forms using 3 different types of construction. You're going to make something with a pinch technique, a coil technique, and a slab technique. I'll show you each one in order. As you work, if you need to add a little extra moisture to your clay, you can use your spray bottle. Please avoid overdoing it because it gets kind of sloppy and difficult to work with. If you have any little dry crumblies that fall off your clay, you want to hold on to those for a reason I'll talk about at the end of the video. But I don't really have any yet, but any little dry crumbs, just sort of push off to the side. Those are going to come in really handy. So first things first, I'm going to cut a little piece to use off of this clay. And remember, for this, we're going to use our wire cutter tool. You can, some people find it more comfortable to go through this way. I always find it more comfortable to come toward myself. So I'm just going to cut off a little bit of the top of this piece of clay. I'm going to put my thumbs on here to hold the block in place. And then I'm just going to pull the wire through and kind of crisscross applesauce it over itself, so I get a little piece that's cut off of my block of clay. I'm going to practice good habits here and put my clay back in the plastic bag while I'm working so it doesn't get dried out. This is an air dry clay that we're working with, which means that once it's dry in the air, it's a little bit difficult to re-wet, so we want to keep it wet. Now I've got this little flat slab of clay. I'm actually going to take this and I'm just going to beat on it. This is a great way to get out all your anger issues if you have any. What I'm trying to do right now is just sort of form this into a little ball. Those of you who've taken a clay class before are probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, aren't you going to wedge this clay? Wedging is sort of like kneading bread dough. It's a process that you do to even out the consistency of clay and get all the air bubbles out of it. And that's really important when you are going to fire or bake your clay in a kiln, because when clay that's got an air bubble inside it gets hot, that air bubble expands and it causes explosions. It causes your piece to blow up in the kiln, sometimes taking out other people's pieces, which does not make you popular, let me tell you. But we're not firing this. Remember, this is air dry clay, so it's okay for us to skip the wedging stage. This air dry clay actually feels pretty good. Sometimes air dry clay has a really, I'm not sure quite how to describe it. It's this weird springy elasticity to it, and it feels a little gross. But this stuff I like. It feels about as close to the regular clay that you use in a ceramics class as you can get. Again, air dry clay never quite as strong when it's dried as traditional clay, but it'll work fine for our purposes. So you want a ball that is somewhere between golf ball and softball size. Not too big. We don't want to get too big with this. In fact, I think I'm going to lose just a little bit of mine and bring mine down a little closer to golf ball size. Okay, so I can just put the extra aside. We're going to start out with the pinch technique of shaping clay. And this is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Starting with this ball, we're going to make a little bowl, and we're going to do this by taking our thumbs, pressing into the surface to make a little indentation. And then from that indentation, we're going to take our finger and our thumb and we're going to pinch them together and move around the surface of the piece in order to shape out kind of a little vase or dish type shape. So you see I'm spinning the clay as I do this and just pinching my thumb and my forefingers together. You can see it start to form out into a little bowl here. I've got some sunlight coming through my window now. Sorry about that if that's distracting on the video. As you're doing this, you're trying to pay attention to what your fingers feel. So with almost everything that we're going to build in this class, we're going to be trying to make the clay about 1/4 of an inch thick. So you can see my rim here is starting to get about 1/4 of an inch thick. But if I feel the bottom, my thumb and my forefinger on the bottom are about that far apart. So I might need to do a little pinching more down here on the bottom to even out that clay. The pinch method is kind of the most basic starter method of clay working that there is. It's something that ancient peoples were doing before there were a whole lot of tools. It may be something that you did in elementary school or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or one of those sorts of things. But you know, surprisingly, it's actually pretty versatile. It does have some downsides to it. It's hard to get the clay perfectly even because you are, you know, just pinching things together and you're relying on your sense of feel. But again, I mean, I've fairly quickly made out something that's a fairly good bowl shape. If I want to, I can use my fingers to start smoothing things out. If I want my upper edge to be a little bit more even, I can do that. You can bring some of your tools into the mix if you want to. So if I have a little spot on my rim that's too tall, I can take, for example, my needle tool and draw through here and just shave a little bit off. You don't have to be too OCD about this. One of the things about a pinch pot is that it does look handmade. But I'll try to make something that looks reasonably nice for this demo. You can also, if you want to experiment with how the tools work for smoothing things out, so I might take my shaper tool here and use it to help me smooth out the inside. Although at the end of the day, I really think your hands are the most versatile tools in working with clay because you can actually feel what is happening under your fingertips. So I'll smooth that out a little bit. I'm going to work on my rim just a little bit more. And then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to shape the back a little bit. Here's where like my wooden rib tool will be really in handy if I want to quickly smooth over the surface. So just use this as an opportunity to feel what the clay does and also feel perhaps what some of your tools are capable of doing in terms of helping you out with the shape. So I'm going to have kind of a, I'm not going to get it super smooth, but I'm going to let the marks of the tool be visible on the exterior here. Turn this back over. I'm going to shape my rim one more time, and then I'm just going to give myself a little pattern in the center here for the sake of fun. Okay, so here it is, my little pinch bowl, reasonably neat and complete. I'm going to set this aside to dry. If I leave it sitting on its underside like it is right now, it is going to get a flat bottom, which is maybe what you want, but I actually want mine to be kind of smooth. So as I let it dry, I'm just going to flip it over and let it dry on its rim, which will help keep this rim flat for me. I'll just set that off to the side while we do our next form. Okay, so first form complete. All right, the next form that I'm going to make is using the coil technique. For this, I want a clean surface so I can brush some extra clay, little dry bits off here. Save them if you have any little dry bits. We can use those for something, which I'll talk about at the end. And also spray a little bit of water on here if you want. Take a paper towel, kind of clean off so you have a nice fresh surface to work from. If you have a lot of dried clay on your hands, same thing. You can wet your hands and use a paper towel to get most of that off of there. You don't want to put any clay down your sink. It's not super important that you have spotless hands, but if you have dry chunks on your hands, they can get into the surface of the wet clay you're working with and be kind of annoying. So anyway, for this, we are going to take a ball of clay that's, say, about the size of a cherry or a small meatball. I'm back on the food analogies for this one. And you are going to use this to make what's known as a coil. A coil is a long cylinder of clay, kind of like a spaghetti noodle of clay, and it is great for building up all kinds of structures. The pinch technique, it's really best at doing sort of bowl-like forms or rounded forms. It's hard to get things that are too complex with the pinch technique, but you can do all kinds of different things with coils. So to make a coil, start out with your little mini meatball of clay, and you're going to take it between your hands and you're going to roll it so it becomes kind of a fat Tootsie Roll, kind of like that. You can do this as much as you can in between your hands, but once it gets to about this length where it's starting to be longer than your palms, you want to put it down on the table and you're going to take both your hands and you're going to roll smoothly back and forth. You can actually do it with one hand too, especially in this case where I have a tabletop that's moving a little bit, but I think it's easier to get it even if you can use both hands. Okay, so you see I'm rolling from the heel of my hands to the tips of my fingers. I'm also moving where my hands are sitting on the surface, so I'm not just rolling right here. I'm rolling here and then shifting them over and rolling here. I'm actually going to move my thing here so I don't have to hold. Can do faster this way on my actual table, and since I'm in my studio, I don't care if I make a mess. But you'll see as it gets longer, I'm moving my hands back and forth. If you're using the cardboard surface and it's on a table, you could tape the cardboard down so you wouldn't have the issue with it moving. Okay. If there's an area that's a little fatter, you can move your hand to that area. But what you're going for is a long, like I said, long spaghetti noodle of clay that's about 1/4 of an inch in diameter. So something that looks kind of like this. I'm going to go ahead and put my surface back down here. Now from this, you can move this spaghetti of clay however you want to. You can make all kinds of different shapes. Before we begin building things with the coil that we rolled out, I want to talk to you about a method that is going to be incredibly important for you as you work with clay. We are hand building in clay. In other words, we're building things manually as opposed to throwing it on a wheel or casting it in a mold or something like that. We're actually building up with our hands. And when you are working with hand building, it is incredibly important that you make sure your forms are structural using a technique called scoring and slipping. So scoring and slipping is a two-part method. The first method is to actually rough up the surface using your needle tool or another tool that will make lines easily. So you're going to score the surface. Most often, people score the surface in parallel lines like hatching in a drawing class. They sometimes also go and do some cross hatching here. The purpose, again, is to rough up the surface and give their more surface area in order for parts to grip together. So this is scoring. You also want to slip the surface. Slipping means putting onto the surface clay that is more liquid than what we have here in this block. That's called slip. Slip is like a liquid clay. It's usually about the consistency of heavy cream or thin milkshake. And there are all kinds of recipes actually for making fancy slip, but in this class, we're just essentially going to mix our clay with some water. And we're going to even go more low tech for this particular exercise because we're going to take our score marks and we're just going to add a little straight water and then take our finger and rub it over the surface so that water gets some clay particles in there. You should be able to see that the slip that we made, the water plus clay particles, kind of sinks into the surface of the scoring. And what it's going to do is it's going to make essentially a glue. This is our glue for clay. So the rough surface helps make more surface area for things to bond, and then the slip itself makes kind of a glue. Anytime you are scoring and slipping two things together, you want to score and slip both sides. It's a little bit tricky because this is never, it's like Elmer's glue, right? If you put two things together with some Elmer's glue, you can still move them while the glue is wet. You have to wait for the glue to dry in order for the things to stay stuck together. And the same thing will happen here. If you put two clay things together that have been scored and slipped, you can still peel them apart while the scoring and slipping is wet. But once it kind of equalizes and dries out to the same consistency of the rest of the clay, you'll have a really strong bond. So that's scoring and slipping. Let's see how it works with our coil structures. So bring back this coil here. So what I am going to do, I'm actually going to get rid of this little chunky end that's kind of awkward looking. I'm going to score the entire surface of this coil. I'm just going to do this method of kind of hatching close together parallel lines. Scoring is kind of a slow process, especially if you're talking about a lot of surface area to cover. So it's a thing that people sometimes when they're in a hurry with clay, they're like, oh, I don't really need to do that. I can get away with just pushing the pieces together really hard. And in fact, if the clay is really wet, sometimes you can kind of get away with that. But the bigger the structure gets, the more weight it has to support, the more important this is. So it's just good to get in the habit of really scoring and slipping everything super well. Part of your grade for your project in clay will be its structural integrity. So if things are falling apart because they weren't scored and slipped, that's not good. Okay, so I've scored and slipped my entire coil surface. If I were gonna like fold this over and join it together, I'd wanna join scored and slipped side to scored and slipped side. But actually what we're gonna do here is we're gonna make a little kind of spiral. So I'm just gonna turn the scored edges in on themselves. So you see here's the scoring and slipping. It's going up against the coil so that it helps glue it together. Now I could score and slip this other side too, but since my clay is wet enough and I've scored and slipped one side, this is one particular instance where I'm not going to worry too much that it's not double scored. Just making sure I'm getting that scored side up against there. Okay. All right, so I've rolled this coil out and I've made kind of a little oval form. It is important that when you score and slip something, you put some pressure from the outside in towards whatever joint you have made. So in this case, my scores are joined together this way, so I'm going to pressure from the outside just to make sure everything's sealing together. One of the nice things about the coil method is it makes this kind of interesting surface, raised surface pattern and texture on here automatically. So that's something you can keep in your vessel form if you want. You can also get rid of it. Your wooden rib tool really help you there if you wanted to smooth something out and have it just be flat, either on one or both sides. You can kind of go in between the coils and use the fatter part of the coil to fill in the thinner part of the coil. You want to make this relatively flat, okay? Since I pushed down on here, it's stuck a little bit, but you see I still have my coils on the back side. So I can kind of have a double-sided 2-for-1 thing. You can also, in this case, I've just made a flat shape with this. I can shape this a little bit. I can use my needle tool to cut an interesting sort of profile. One of the things that coils do really well is they build up shaped forms really well. So I'm going to go with kind of a kidney shape here for what I'm going to build up. Okay. Before I start building up, I'm just going to make sure, that looks kind of cool actually, I'm going to make sure that it's not stuck down to my surface because I want to be able to get my little pot off of there afterwards. And I've made another coil, so I am ready to start building up. The way that you build up something into 3 dimensions, again, right now we just have a flat shape, so I want to build up a 3-dimensional form coming this way. We are going to take our needle tool and we're going to score right along whatever part of our flat base that we want to attach our next coil. So some scoring there. I'm also going to score and slip just like I did before, the entire length of this coil. Now I should point out that one of the things that makes coil construction just so incredibly versatile is that you can do different shapes. So I can shape a coil exactly to the shape of this base. I can also go outside the line, so to speak. So I could have just, say, a circular coil built up in the center here. So you can pretty much make any shape that you can think of with the coil method. It is very, very flexible in that way. The disadvantage to it, if there is one, is that it is kind of slow. Some people get frustrated at having to roll out all these coils and bit by bit score and slip everything. That may be you. This may not be something that works for you, but if you're a more methodical person and you kind of like to think things out as you go and really have a lot of flexibility, coil method is very, very powerful. Okay, so I've got this all scored and slipped. Now I'm going to take my coil, score and slip side to the score and slip side that I did on my base. And I'm just going to, actually going to cut this down a little bit so it's easier to work with. I'm just going to follow the lines of my base I've established till I get to the end. I will cut this off, kind of pinch, use my pinch method to pinch the ends together. And then, as I said, pressure is important here, so I'm pushing down from the top to kind of squish those rough surfaces and all of the slip that's in there together so they really hold well. Sometimes it can be very advantageous to just go in and seal the edges a little bit where the coils come together. So I'm kind of this joint from between the base and the coil that I just added. But really it's the pressure as much as anything. The pressure so that that rough surface and the slip meld together. Okay, so I've got my first little level here. If I can peel this back, you see what I said about this is still wet. So it's just like the Elmer's glue. If I try to move it too much, it'll move, but I just want you to see from the side what's happening here. Push that back down again, and then I'm going to leave it alone. This requires a little bit of patience, which I don't necessarily possess, to put this down and then just stop futzing with it. Not my strong suit. Okay, so I'm going to go again, and I'm going to score. One of the super cool things about the coil method of working is that you can actually change the profile gradually as you go. So I could make my next layer wider, for example, than the layer I just made, or narrower, or kind of have something go in and out. It's very, very versatile. Okay, so score and slip. Here's my scored and slipped edge for my other one. So I'm just going to do the same thing. Put those two scored and slipped edges together. I'm going to make this expand out just a little bit, so I'm going to make my next one slightly wider than my first one was. I'm running out of coil here, but I'm just going to pinch off a little coil from the other one and patch that hole. Shh, don't tell anybody. Okay, and same thing, some downward pressure to really get things to stick together there. You can do things with coils where you only build it up on one part. You know, maybe I want this to be a thing that's asymmetrical on the top and higher on one side. So I'll use this last little bit of coil I have to sort of build up the one side, and then I can since clay is soft, I can sort of smooth it down on there, so there's kind of a gradual transition between those. Okay, and again, I can leave the natural coil quality of it if I want to. I can also smooth it out using, say, my rib tool. So if I wanted the outside, for example, to be flat and the inside to show the coils, so just because you're using coils doesn't mean you have to show coils, if that made sense. Paradoxically, for this assignment, you actually do need to show me the coils in at least one part of your sculpture. So don't smooth everything out. Leave at least one part. You know, you don't have to smooth anything, but if you want to, don't smooth it all out, at least until you've taken a picture, so that I know that you actually built it with coils and didn't do it with some other sneaky method. Okay, so if I can get this guy off of here. It's very wet clay. So I would not be moving this if it weren't for the fact that it's a demo and I want you to see the sides of it. But here I've got from the top my sort of kidney shaped vessel, and you can see where I smoothed it out on the outside, but it's relatively still coiled in the inside, and I'm starting to get up some depth here. I have another one that I made earlier, and same kind of thing. You can see that it is starting to get some height to it. So that is the coil method. What you are required to turn in for this is a coil vessel of some type, a bowl or a vase or a weird little, like I said, shaped something. And it needs to have at least 5 levels of coils on it. So I have 1, 2, 3, and then there's actually a 4th here, but 5 levels of coils. So it'll probably be at least this high. If you feel ambitious and you want to go higher, that's amazing. You could make yourself something really cool just because you want to, but at minimum, I need to see a height of 5. Okay, for our third and final form that you're going to practice for this little exercise, we're going to be doing some slab construction. So slabs are flat planes of clay, and they can be made in a number of ways. The probably easiest way to make sort of a slab is to have a block of clay like you received in class. And if you are good with your wire cutting tool, you can put your wire cutting tool in so that it's about 1/4 of an inch into the length of the clay, and then your task is just to be very even as you cut through, something I have never super excelled at with the wire cutters. But your goal is to just get a piece of clay that is pretty evenly about 1/4 of an inch thick all the way around. That is one way to make a slab. So you can certainly do that if you are feeling confident with your wire cutting skills. This is a small slab, but we're making a small thing, so it works pretty well. Another thing that you can do to make a slab is you can cut a piece of clay that is not an even slab like this, or like the one that I just did, and you can put it down and you can give it some punishment, slap it out flat with your hand. You'll notice that every time I hit it a few times, I turn it over. If I don't do that and I just slap it repeatedly, it's just gonna stick to the surface of whatever I'm working on, okay? So here again, we have something that's about 1/4 of an inch. If you're working on a bigger slab and you're doing this, moving your hand around the surface is very important, but there we go. There's another little way to make a slab. The third way, and the one that's best for making big slabs, and it's gonna be very important for us in our Project 3 sculpture, is to cut a piece of clay that's somewhat thicker than what you're going to be working with. So I'm going to cut this one that I have here about in half. So I have something that's maybe about 1/2 an inch thick. Then you can give it a little corporal punishment. I usually slap it down a few times just to make sure everything's all even. And then you're going to use that cylindrical object that's rigid that I told you about, and you're going to roll that back and forth across the surface. You're going to flip it. You're going to do that again. Roll that across the surface. Flip it. If I want to, I can go sideways, top to bottom. However, I need to move the clay to get the width and shape of slab that I want. So see, I'm kind of rolling the bottle just from one end to another. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on this bottle at all. I'm just letting it roll over with like a gentle hand pressure. And you can see I've rolled out a pretty big slab here. When you do the roll out method of building a slab, again, don't forget to flip it over. This is the #1 thing people do, is they just start going to town and rolling, and then they try to pick up their slab and it's completely stuck and everything is the worst. So don't do that, flip it over. And the other thing is, you'll always get some kind of gunky edges when you do this. It's just the nature of rolling it out, but you can use your needle tool to just trim those up a little bit more evenly. And then you end up with
That's a beautiful slab right there. Look at that sucker. It's gorgeous. Okay. So that is rolling out a slab. You're going to get really good at this over the next few weeks, I presume. We want our slabs in this class to be about 1/4 of an inch thick. You can go very slightly thinner if you feel confident, but you don't want to go any thicker. Like, you're not going to want to build with slabs like this, because that is going to use a whole lot of material and be very, very heavy. Another disadvantage we didn't talk about earlier with clay is that it is heavy. So we have to be careful to be as thin with our things as we can be and still be structural. All right, so I have 3 little pieces of slab here that I have rolled out or cut out or patted out that I can use to do this next little demo. I'm actually going to take the one I cut and roll it out just a little bit. The best thing for you to do with this particular exercise is to roll out your slabs or cut them or pat them, whichever way you're doing them, and then go away for a little while, say a half hour, maybe as much as an hour. Just go away and let them dry a little bit. Right now, my clay is really, really malleable and soft. It's right out of the bag. It's really wet, which is really great if you're going to pinch something or if you're going to roll out a coil. It's not so great if you're going to put things together with a slab, because we want our slabs to some degree to hold their width and shape. So having them be super flexible is not ideal for us. We want them to be what's known as leather hard. So things that are like my pinch pot here, where I can still move things a little bit, but it also, if I tap on it or pinch it lightly, it's not just going to flex super easy because it's a little bit dry. So leave them out for a half hour if you want to, not longer than that. If they start to get white or lighter, it's too long, but a little bit. I am not going to do that just because you know, I want to finish this demo and have you see what these things look like. So what I'm going to make with my slabs is a little box. Slabs are actually super, super versatile, but the box is kind of the forms that people start with the most often. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to cut the shape that I want for my base on the slab, and I'm just going to, again, use my needle tool to cut through and make the width and length of kind of box form that I want. I'm going to do kind of a fun little thing where I have straight sides, but actually a curved end on what I'm doing. You, when you're doing your exercises, pinch, slab, and coil, you feel free to get creative with it. People always want to make the exact same thing that I made, but you don't have to. You can make your box type form, whatever shape that you want to. So here's my base for my box. I'm going to start out the same way that I started out for my pinch pot. I'm going to score and slip. So I'm going to go ahead and score all along the edge where I'm going to want a slab to fit in there. Okay. And then I'm going to go to one of my other slabs that I created, and I'm going to measure some edges here. Mine actually, since it's a curve, I could conceivably go all the way around it, but I don't have a slab that's long enough to do that anyway. So I'm just going to put it at where the corner would be for this, and I'm going to measure where that edge is, and I'm going to cut an edge. You can actually use a ruler for cutting slabs. I was not together enough to have a ruler here, but you know what I do have is a little piece of paper. So I'm just going to put a little piece of paper here as sort of a straight edge and cut right along that edge there. Now I have something that is the width that I want it to be, and then I'm just going to decide how tall I want this sucker to be. I'm going to go with a very unscientific, not that tall. I'm going to cut another piece here, and then I'm going to stack that first piece on top of the second, and I'm actually going to make 2 the same size. Why? 2 edges of my box. Okay. Scoring and slipping. I've already scored the surface down here, but I'm going to score the base that joins with it. This is especially important for slab construction where you're putting edge to edge because there's not a lot of surface area. So we've got to rough it up and make that extra surface area. You'll notice sometimes I spray my finger just to get like a drop of water on the finger, and then I sort of put it into the surface. Sometimes I'll also just spray on the surface, but I try to avoid getting too horribly much water on the surface of the clay because it does absorb it, and eventually it gets really kind of sloppy and unhappy and it's not very much fun to work with. So control the amount of slip. But you can see I'm going to line these two edges up, the edge here and the edge here, and then I'm just going to tip it up and press down. Grr. Same thing over here. Line it up and press down. And then I'm actually going to use a tool to seal the edges a little bit on this because there isn't much surface area. So while I'm pushing down, I'm going to take this point of the shaping tool that we have here and just really make sure that that's sealed together nice and tight. Same thing on this one. Really seal that together just to help it stay in place. And then I'm going to do it from the outside too. I'm just going to, I don't know if I can tip this up so you can see it a little better. I'm just going to run the tool along here, smooth that out and make it look seamless basically. Tip this back up. Okay, so I have two sides of my little box here. Much faster in terms of building up verticality than the coil method. But again, we're working with flat planes of clay, so it's not always as easy to shape things exactly where you want them to go. Here I put the edge. Here's the joint, the edge on the base, but I could also do this if I wanted to, where I put this so that it elongates the box. Basically, it sits down here instead of sitting up here. So I'll do that just so you can see how that works with this corner. So I'm going to take my slab, sort of measure out how much I need, make a little line there, cut that down. I'm going to measure how high it needs to be, use a found straight edge in my case, since I was not together enough to put a ruler on my table. You'd think sitting in my studio would actually have a ruler handy, but you would think wrong if that's what was on your mind. Okay. All right, so that should fit more or less right in this spot. Now, since I'm doing the edge, I'm going to score and slip the edge here. And then I'm going to score and slip right in here. It's okay if your score marks go up above wherever it is you're joining. That's better than not having enough. Have you gotten the sense that scoring and slipping is important yet? It's really important. Whoops. I'm also going to score along here, and I'm actually going to score along here too. So anywhere that clay might end up joining together, I'm ready. This looks like it looks a little like a casket right now. Sorry, y'all. I promise I'm not trying to make some sort of dark commentary through my clay demonstration. All right, put it back down here, and then we're just going to wrap this guy right around the curve. Right around the curve here. And when we get to the edge, I'm going to use my pinch method to pinch the two sides together because I want it to be in a curve. If I were having a perfectly straight line here, I could just put the edges together kind of like the butt end joint like you learned from cardboard, rabbit joint without the seal, basically. But I have a curved edge here, so I want that to be kind of mooshed together. Your hands are, like I said earlier, the most versatile of your tools because you can feel what you're doing. But the clay tools themselves are really excellent in part because they have, most of them, a narrow edge that puts a lot of pounds per square inch on the surface of whatever it is that you're doing. So when you have something like this where you're trying to meld some clay together and really make it seamless, bringing your tool in and using it to smooth things out is going to be really important. I can see I didn't measure my height very well. It's a little too tall, but that's okay. I'm just going to cut it after the fact with my needle tool so that it all lines up nice and neat and is all sealed together pretty smoothly. Again, pressure is important, so anywhere there's a score and slip joint, you're going to push it together so that you're sure that it's really glued. And remember, these are not really glued until they dry. So mine's holding together pretty well, but if I picked it up and shook it, these joints would fall apart. They are not solid until that slip dries to at least the same consistency as the clay around it. Okay. I think on this other side, just to show you the difference, I'll go ahead and make a straight edge on this side. That's a little too narrow. You end up usually when you're working with slabs having all these extra little bits and you're trying to find which ones work most economically in the space that you have left. Maybe if I did an interior cut here, that would work pretty well. So I'm going to measure how wide I need this to be. Test it to make sure it fits in there. Oh, perfetta. Okay, cut that down so I've got a little piece that just sits right in the end cap there. Score and slip every surface that joins. So up the sides, on the bottom. On here, I'm going to go along the sides and along the bottom. Get our fake version of slip in there. Whoops. I know that one of the disadvantages to doing these demos by videos is you all can't ask questions as I'm working. So if you have any questions about this processes that we're doing here and it's not answered by the video, you can always send me an email, or you can ask in class, hey, I saw this in the video and I don't really understand what you meant by that. And I'm happy to coach you through. I know that that can be kind of a difficult thing with the remote learning that we are doing in this class. All right, so I'm just using my tool on the outside to seal everything together, putting pressure. Geez, it really looks like a coffin now, y'all. My Egyptian sarcophagus, ode to Egyptian sarcophagi. I totally just wanted to say sarcophagi there. Okay. So then I can just shape things a little bit, and you can see how it looks from the side. Okay. Oops, there's a place that needs to be sealed together a little better. So I can take a look at how everything looks. Again, minimize your handling until your scoring and slipping actually is dry. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to build a little lid for this guy here, just to make it look that much more Dracula-esque. I'm having like way too much fun making a creepy little thing, y'all. Okay, so this is the only piece of slab I have left, and it's not quite big enough. So I'm going to join two slabs together. That's a helpful thing to know how to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to score the top of this one and the bottom of this one, slip them both, and then I'm going to push one onto the other. I'm not going to join the two ends, you know, totally flat, because there's just not enough surface area to make a strong joint. But then I'm going to press them together, use a tool to help me get it really nice and smooth. And then if I want to cut off the extra bits, I can do that. And now we basically have one slab that we can work with here. All right, so I'm going to put this back on, and I'm going to measure what I need to do. Actually, what I'm going to do is flip this over so I can just trace around. Carefully pull the box off, and then I can just basically draw through. It's going to be such a pleasure for some of you, I'm sure, who have contentious relationships with X-Acto knives like I do, to cut clay, because it just cuts so easily. You don't have to put any effort into it at all, really. Just draw right through it. Okay, smooth that out a little bit. And then I've got my box here, which I misshaped a little bit while I was moving it. All right, so I'm going to take this lid and I'm just going to taper it in a little bit so it's got a nice beveled edge on it. This is the fun part of working with clay, is just coming up with creative things to do. I'm not going to seal these two together because this is meant to be a lid. I think what I will do, though, is I will make a little coil, just a small one, and then I'm just going to loop that over, score the bottom, score the top, slip and slip. Actually going to take this off of here to put the pressure on it so it doesn't seal to my coffin base. Okay, so you can see I have a little handle here now. I could spend a lot more time smoothing this out and making it perfect, but I'm not going to worry about that for the purposes of this demo. Trim off a little bit of extra, bevel that edge again, and here we go. I have a little box with a lid. Once it's dry, it'll be held in place, and I can, I don't know, put my murder instruments in it. That's what it looks like a box this shape is totally for murder instruments. Note to all of you, I do not have any murder incidents, but there you go. You have a little box. So you all, for your demo piece, at least need to make a vessel form that's got a base like this and some walls. It does not have to necessarily have curved walls, but that's a great thing for you to do to just prove to yourself that you know how to do it, but it does need to at least have 4 walls and stand up a couple inches from the base. If you want to make a little lid for yourself just because you want to make something cool, that's extra bonus, good for you, but this right here is basically what I need to see. So these are your 3 forms that you will show off to me when you turn in the tasks for this project. A pinch, a coil, and a slab construction. You'll take photographs of, you can do all 3 together, each one individually, provided I can see the coils on the coil pot and, you know, the slab construction, see that it's put together well. That's totally fine. Okay, last couple of bits that we need to talk about with this video. First and foremost, I mentioned earlier that you wanted to save all the dry little bits off to the side. I have not been doing a very good job doing that, but you can potentially see that I have, you know, a whole bunch of little crumblies here. If you have some dried crumblies that are completely dry, so they've turned kind of white, what you're going to do with those is take your container that you've been saving and you're going to put them in the container and hold on to them. These little dry bits are the best thing in the world for making slip. So if I take these super dry bits and I add just a little bit of water, they will dissolve evenly in the water and they'll make a nice liquid clay that is an even more effective glue than the sort of lowbrow clay we were making with water and our finger. So hold on to these bad boys. You'll see the difference in color between a chunk that is still wet and the chunks that are dry. So you want them to be totally dry. Ones like this will not dissolve in the water, weirdly enough. I think it's because they already have water suspended around the clay molecules, but this was, if you put this in your slip bucket, it's basically going to sit in there like a turd in the bottom of the bowl, just to give you a super visual that you will never forget. So only the ones that are completely dry and white, hold on to those, put them in your little plastic container and bring them with you to class. The other thing is clean up. I just want to remind you that any extra clay that you have that's still nice and malleable like this clay, you can kind of form it together in a ball, or you can even, you know, slap on it a few times and put it together with what's left of your brick of clay. You're going to put it back in the bag and seal it up. This will come back to class with you as well. Your clay tools and things like that, you should clean off every single time that you use them. So the way that it's easiest to do that if you're not in the classroom is to get them wet with your spray bottle or a wet paper towel, and you're just going to peel off as much of that clay grossness as you can. You want them to be pretty clay free. You can sometimes use one tool to clean off the big chunks on another tool so that you don't have to do as much scrubbing. Okay, so get off all the big chunks, and once it's like this, where it's pretty clean, it might just have a little bit of clay dust on it. This you can put in the sink and you can clean off. That's just fine. That's not going to hurt your sink. Same thing with your hands. I always just kind of spray my hands when I'm at home and use a paper towel to wipe off as much of the clay as I can so that my fingers are just basically dusty. They don't actually have any big chunks of clay on them, like my fingers here. And then I can take myself to the sink and I can clean off the just a little bit of residue that's on there. Clay is super hard on your hands. It's going to dry your skin out pretty unforgivingly, and it's the middle of winter, so that doesn't help us right now. So you may want to have some lotion on hand for yourself so that you don't end up with dry, old person desiccated like zombie hands. All right, that is it for your clay demo. Make your 3 structures, take pictures of them, and upload them to the assignment. In addition to that, just work on that Project 2 sculpture. The new due date for that is February 28th. So I look forward to seeing really amazing cardboard sculptures from that. Have a great day, and I will see you in class.